Sing, sing, song, ding, ding, dong. UK hun. Ooh, that's good. Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. Today I am doing a February wrap-up. So I have 12 books to discuss with you today. I don't know why I'm talking like this. Let me snap out of it. So yeah, before we get into it, as always, I'll share what I'm drinking. Predictable Me has a Renhouse Brewing beer. It's called Prairie Ghost. It's a alt-style beer. It's like a malty session dark beer, which is like not usually my thing, but since it was like a sessionable one, I like it. I like it on occasion, like when the weather's kind of like cooler, if it's rainy, like it's the vibe. So yeah, I'm gonna try to crush these before it gets super hot out, and I will just be drinking sours and IPAs for the foreseeable future. So gotta get through these. Compared to like a better tasting Guinness. That's the best way to describe it, I think. Okay, so let's get into the wrap up. So the first book that I read was my least favorite I've read this year. Least favorite I've read in a while, so I'm glad it's first, we can get out of the way. And it is Department of Speculation by Jenny Offill. I really dislike this book. I don't think this is a bad book. However, I really think that the fragmentary style in which this book was told is just not my cup of tea usually. I think in this particular book, it just did not work well. So we're in the mind of a wife who is married to this man and she has a child. And as things go along in the book, things start to crumble in their relationship. And through the fragmentary style of this book, you kind of get snippets of her thoughts and just various things that she's thinking that might be like completely random for what's going on in the plot. And due to this, it was really hard for me to get like in the swing of reading this book. Like often Jenny Offill will throw in like a fragment that is supposed to be connected to the previous ones. However, it's kind of unclear at times what she's trying to do. And I would sit there like thinking like, why is this fragment here? Like, what does this mean in relation to the previous paragraph? And it would just get me pulled out of the story. And I just don't like that kind of confused reading that I felt while reading this book. So I feel like this fragmentary style can sometimes distance the reader, even though it's intended to kind of get you in the mindset of the narrator. And I think the premise of a failing marriage is really interesting to use this kind of interiority of a fragmentary, kind of like stream of consciousness vibe. However, here it was fragmented to the point where I just did not care about the characters. I didn't feel like I got to know them at all. I didn't really care about the plot. It was kind of like a basic kind of crumbling marriage plot, and there was like nothing more to it that the fragmentary style kind of gave to it. And overall, it just kind of felt like a big pile of nothing to me. I'm really glad this book was super short because I read it in like a day or two, but it felt like it took forever. I was just waiting for the end to come. And so, yeah, I know this one does get a lot of praise from some other people on here. So yeah, maybe it'll be for you, but it was not my style. I actually read another fragmentary novel this month that I really did like. So it's coming up in my stack. But yeah, I don't know if I'm a hard against fragmentary style, but I don't know. I'm wary, basically. The next book I read was Clara and the Sun by Kazuo Ishiguro, which is out now and was kindly sent to me by the publisher. I really enjoyed this book. So we follow a robot named Clara, and she is powered by like artificial intelligence, and she's solar powered, so she has a strong faith in the sun. And she's a model called B2, which is a little bit of an outdated model compared to the newer robots with AI called B3s that have like better cognition, and they're considered to have like better skills, I guess. And so we meet Clara as she's in a shop as she's waiting to be purchased by a friend of hers. And she eventually is purchased while waiting and being placed in different areas in the shop. And she kind of spends her time looking out of the store's front window and kind of just giving observations about what she sees, about the society that is around her as she's trying to like comprehend what it is. And Clara's unique in the sense that she's very observational and very bright in terms of her trying to grasp what's going on around her while being, a robot. So it's interesting in terms of Ishiguro trying to characterize this artificial intelligence in the way that she kind of feels like a human, in the sense that she has like a personality and she isn't just smart at like adapting to things. She kind of has like a position on things, which is really interesting. And so she's eventually purchased by a young girl that has an unspecified illness. And as we learn more about this young girl, and as she's taken out of the store and moved into the home with this family, Kazuo Ishiguro does his thing in terms of diving into some really complex themes involving humanity. In the sense that Clara is really indebted to the sun and believes in his power as like a god, she often ponders the sun's power to change things, or believing strongly that the sun will, help this girl with her illness. It's a really interesting look at fate and ultimately personhood, and whether identity is something that's intra or interpersonal between the way that we are just kind of ingrained with our natural characteristics, or whether the effects of others, such as our family, has on who we ultimately are. And another really interesting theme covered here is the general societal desire for constant optimization. This is a vaguely dystopian world similar to the one explored in Never Let Me Go. And so a lot of the themes here involving like identity, humanity, what's the purpose of life are very similar. However, it's tackled in a much different manner. But overall, I think Ishiguro does a really good job of exploring these themes. And if you liked Never Let Me Go, I really think you'll like this one. I think we get a really interesting perspective of being in the mind of an AI, which is really cool to me. And I was really moved by the story. I really loved Clara as a character. I thought the themes explored were, while the story was going on, I was a little bit unclear as to like what I was supposed to be getting from it, but by the end of it, I was like, oh, I see. So I think a reread would be really beneficial for this one, just like Never Let Me Go. Once you kind of like get through the mystery of what's going on in this world, it's really interesting to think back about all the things that happened in the book and the way he kind of left clues for the reader, especially from the perspective of Clara, who doesn't know much about the world that she's living in. So it was just a really immersive, propulsive read. Really liked it. And yeah, I recommend it. Next, I have Summerwater by Sarah Moss. This one was sent to me by FSG, and I really like this book. So we follow 12 characters in what is essentially 12 different short stories. And all these characters, whether they're from certain families or just by themselves, they're vacationing at this cabin park in Scotland over the course of one very rainy day. And it's very dreary, raining the entire day. And so each short story, you go in between each character's perspective and learn more about them and kind of get their own personal history, kind of their thoughts, in a very like close third-person narrative that's very like stream of conscious in a way as well. And what these stories kind of look at is they're often dark and sometimes funny, but they're looking at familial expectation. And as you go between each character, you kind of learn more and more about the situation that they're facing, and it kind of lends itself to exploring themes of Brexit and xenophobia by the end of the book. And as each story goes along, you kind of know it's building up to something, but you're not really clear what it is. And when it does, it's a really excellent payoff, a really interesting and unexpected ending that I thought. And I would say that the Brexit themes and underpinnings throughout this book kind of flew over my head, as I'm from the US. And so that was one thing that I kind of wish I knew a little bit more about to kind of get the full nuances of that discussion here. But overall, just from like a short story in a novel perspective, I really like this. I think the nature writing alone was so evocative. It was incredibly immersive. I felt like I was there, and even now, like thinking back on this book, like I feel like I've been to Scotland in this little cabin vacation park. It was really so immersive. I haven't really read a book that was this immersive from that perspective in terms of the nature writing. And I just think she's a really beautiful writer, and I love this. I thought it was really good, and I'm excited to check out more of her stuff. Okay, next I have Let Me Tell You What I Mean by Joan Didion, also kindly sent to me by the publisher Knopf. This is my first Joan Didion book, and I've been wanting to read her for a while, and this is like the brand new books, and it was super short, so I was like, you know what, I'll give her essays a try, and I'm glad I did. I really love her clear yet incisive reporting and writing style. I think you can kind of see her influence on modern nonfiction writers such as Gia Tolentino. I think that influence is it makes so much sense now that I kind of get a sense of what her writing is like. What I love most about her writing is that she covers a variety of subjects in this collection. These are all previously published but previously uncollected essays of hers from the 60s until the year 2000. In each essay, she gets to the core of her subject so well, and it's almost like insane how good she is at getting to the root of what she wants to analyze in the very brief amount of pages she has. While I don't think this is the most groundbreaking piece of nonfiction I've read in a while, I think each of the essays are kind of, they're covering a bunch of different topics. It doesn't really feel cohesive as a collection. However, I think Didion's voice alone is anchor in itself, and it's all you really need to kind of pull her together. She has such a clear perspective and unique writing style and the way that she approaches her reporting that I think just having her write this book alone is enough for it to be a bomb collection. So I think she's like a slyly comedic writer, which I really like. I caught like little jokes here and there that were really funny. And she does it in a subtle way where she's not really trying to be comedic, but she just kind of finds the natural humor in her subjects. And so yeah, I really like this. Can't wait to read more from her. I know she has a documentary on Netflix, and I really want to watch that now to learn more about her and her process and everything. So yeah, really liked it. Beer break. Next up, I read Kink, a story collection. It's an anthology edited by Kwon and Garth Greenwell. This was sent to me by the publisher Simon & Schuster, which is awesome. I heard about this book, I think, in late 2020, and it was immediately one of my most anticipated reads of this year. The list of authors that are included in this book is insane. We have Roxane Gay, Alexander Chee, Brandon Taylor, Carmen Maria Machado. Like, it's a stacked collection. However, I do think that this book is somewhat of a mixed bag. I think the through line of this book is clearly about kink, but I would say it's more so just about sex in the way that it exposes different things. I mean, one of the core themes that's explored here is power and relationships, and looking at relationships in the way that personal desire and societal expectations kind of play into relationships and sex. You know, even more broad, it covers this discussion of relationships and sex and kink in light of race and class and sexuality and gender identity in a really excellent way. I think every story here is quite unique. It doesn't really play into the same tropes in every story. I think it's a really good, diverse collection of characters and stories that are represented here. And I definitely think it's worth your time. I think some of the stories here are worth the price of admission alone. I think my favorite stories were by Alexander Chee, Brandon Taylor, Larissa Pham, and Kim Fu. I think those are my 4 favorite stories from this collection. They were excellent. So, and I just really appreciate that this book has been published, and I love that we're seeing sex and kink being embraced so wholeheartedly and unabashedly, not using this as just looking at sex for sex's sake, but using this as a underpinning to explore really interesting ideas. And so, yeah, I really liked this book. Not the strongest anthology, I think, but overall, I really enjoyed my time with it, and I would recommend it if you are interested in the premise of reading some sexy stories. So next, I read A Separation by Katie Kitamura, and this book was excellent. I loved it so much. This is one of those books that I particularly love in terms of being in the head of a female narrator who is just kind of lost and thinking about things and some of the messiness that's gone on in her life and pondering that and her place in the world. It's definitely a thing that I enjoy in my fiction, and this is definitely that. I think this is one of the lowest rated Goodreads books that I have on my shelves and that I've read. It has a 2.9 on Goodreads, which I think is completely rude. This book is so good. I think the reason why it is rated so low on Goodreads is that it's kind of pitched as a mystery in the sense that our narrator gets a call from her husband's mom asking where her husband is, meaning the mom's son. What she doesn't reveal to the mom is that her and her husband have been secretly separated for, I think, 6 months. And so she doesn't know where he is. All that is known is that he's been to Greece. And so the narrator, she kind of ends up agreeing to go look for him. However, she kind of does it in a false way in the sense that she doesn't really want to find him. But when she gets there, she kind of notices some things are kind of off with the situation, and she's a bit increasingly worried about what might have happened to her husband. And I'll kind of leave it there because things kind of take a bit of a turn. However, this isn't a very plotty novel at all. It's very much a reflection of this narrator on her relationship. And as you learn some more about it, kind of the way that changes her perspective of the relationship and her reckoning with that in a form of kind of grief. And I thought it was an excellent exploration of that topic. And I just really had a good time seeing how the narrator would kind of reckon with her relationship and the way that she kind of got to this place with her husband and her trying to navigate her feelings in this really unique setting as well. Overall, it's extremely interior, and while it has minimal plot, I think there's so much to learn from this. If you like a good character study and kind of like a meandering plot in terms of reflecting on failing marriage or like divorce, those kind of topics, I think this is your book. So yeah, it does carry some, naturally mysterious aspects which kind of lead the plot to be propulsive. However, I would say it's more so a reflection on marriage and grief and reckoning with those things and kind of moving on from a relationship. And so yeah, it's a really, really beautiful novel. I loved it. I cannot wait to read her new book coming out this summer called Intimacies. Her sentences are just absolutely bonkers good. The writing is so beautiful. It's kind of like my favorite type of writing, where it's very clear and precise and sharp, but it's also very beautiful at the same time. Well, not being like lyrical or poetic per se, but just really good insights throughout here about relationships. And yeah, I loved it. I thought about it a lot after I finished it as well, so definitely recommend. Next, as promised, another fragmentary novel called No One Is Talking About This by Patricia Lockwood. This is basically what I would describe as a Twitter internet novel. What I thought was interesting about this book was that it's a fragmentary novel, but it's told from the third person perspective, which was really interesting and unexpected. I thought we were going to be like in the head of a narrator, but we're not. And so we follow this woman who rose to some social media fame on Twitter for a tweet that was, "Can dogs be twins?" And she's a very, naturally funny character. And the first part of this book is told the whole book is told in fragments, but the first part of it is mostly, it reads as a series of tweets in the sense that it's a lot of very different reflections on a variety of things, a lot of like Twittery jokes in here that are all kind of tied together by looking at kind of like the general malaise that we see on the internet now in Twitter. Like if you're on Twitter, you know what I mean? Like kind of like the constant, very disparate pieces of thinking and jokes and like depression and just kind of like a middling feeling about life. And so the first half, it took me a little bit to get into this book. I think it was a little bit daunting. I was a little bit nervous that I wasn't going to like it, because what naturally comes for me in fragmentary novels is sometimes like references or little bits of the prose kind of get lost to me. I'm like, wait, what does that mean? But I think if you keep going with it, things kind of make more sense and you kind of get into a flow of reading the book. What I really love the most about this book is that in part 2, something happens in the character's family that kind of pulls her out of what she calls the portal in terms of being stuck on her phone and scrolling all day, and she has to reckon with the real life. So the end was so beautiful. I almost cried by the end of it. I'm not going to say why or anything, but it was a really interesting look at the way that the real life interplays with the internet, and the way that we often kind of deflect what we're experiencing in real life by, immersing ourselves so totally in our personhood that is only reflected in the internet. And when something happens outside of our phones, how that kind of impacts us. What I really like is this isn't just like a bland kind of internet novel kind of discuss the qualms or the poor things about the internet. It's really looking at the way that the internet has constructed itself, in the way that we rely on the internet to support our personalities and the way that we see the world and the way we connect with other people, and how that can be flipped upside down in an instant. And overall, I thought it was so brilliant. I was blown away by this book by the end of it. I loved it so much. Now I don't know where I stand on Fragments. So thank you, Patricia Lockwood. She's very funny, so recommend it. I feel like I've been talking forever. Jesus Christ. Okay, next I have a doozy of a novel, and that is Die My Love by Ariana Harwicz, translated by Sarah Moses and Carolina Orloff. This book was an absolute trip. I just talked about this in my reading vlog, but this book was absolutely a trip, a fever dream, brutal, hard to get through at times, violent, just like gut punch of a book. So we're following this woman who is living in the French countryside with her husband and her son, who's I think like 6 months old or so. And what becomes apparent is that she's suffering from postpartum depression, and she's kind of reckoning with being a new mother and just kind of hating everything. And she's like a very seething, unlikable narrator in the sense that we're deep in her mind, and she thinks the most perverse and messed up things about her husband, about herself, about her child. And so it's very easy to be very put off by this narrator. I don't know too much about postpartum depression, so I fear I'm going to talk about it in an incorrect way, but basically this woman is going through a lot mentally, and it's really impacting the way that she's perceiving herself and her relationship and herself as a mother, and trying to figure out what she wants out of life. And what's interesting is that her husband's family kind of plays into, or just kind of sets aside, her feelings and the way that she's exhibiting this really odd behavior. And so it's really unfortunate seeing the way that her husband kind of gaslights her and doesn't really offer her the help that she needs. And so she's like in this toxic relationship while having these terrible thoughts, and you kind of just see her gradual descent into madness. And so as things go on, things are getting darker and darker and worse for this character, and you're like, what is going to happen? So it's super suspenseful, and it keeps you riveted to the plot. And so I definitely would recommend it if you like books that follow women that are really in a dark place, if you like being in the mind of someone that's a bit unhinged at the time. I think this is an excellent exploration of motherhood and personhood, and reckoning with all of those things in light of personal struggle and demons. And it was just, it was so good. It is a lot to handle, I think, at times. There's a lot of really just explicit, messed up things in this book. You have to kind of want like a bleak, dark book. You have to be in the mood for that if you're going to go into this one, I think. But overall, it was really, really good, and I really enjoyed it. I love these kind of books. If you follow my channel, you know this is like my vibe. So yeah, really good, very brief, a lot. Next, in a much different note, I read The Swallowed Man by Edward Carey. I really enjoyed this book. It's basically a retelling of Pinocchio, and we follow Pinocchio's father in the sense that he created Pinocchio, and he is kind of a lonely man who had a pretty poor, lonely childhood as well, crafts items out of wood, and he ends up making this small man who comes to life. What happens is he gradually becomes like a father figure to Pinocchio, and one day he kind of is so relentless in his fatherhood and his control over Pinocchio and his expectations for him that Pinocchio escapes and leaves and goes missing. And it's believed that he's out in the sea, and so Geppetto, the main character, he goes out in a small boat and gets swallowed by a whale. So he's telling his story in the stomach of this whale, and he's writing in a book that he finds in a ship within the whale's stomach. So it's a big fish, and he's living there where he finds some rations and is writing his story about how he created Pinocchio and why he is here, and just dealing with all of these things. And what I loved most about this is while it begins and feels as a fairy tale, this is a really amazing reflection on fatherhood and grief and regret mostly. And it was really moving being in the mind of Geppetto and kind of figuring out how he got here, how his perspective kind of caused him to treat Pinocchio this way, and now him reckoning with all of the regret that he has for treating Pinocchio the way he did. It is kind of odd thinking about this as, a piece of wood that came to life. And so initially, this isn't something I would normally like kind of like this fantasy, fantastical story, but I think despite these like small magical realism elements, I think this is a really awesome piece of fiction in terms of how it uses classic tale to kind of discuss something more and look deeply at loneliness and grief, and ultimately just being a really adventurous and exciting book about trying to figure out whether he's going to get out of this whale's stomach, basically. So yeah, I really recommend this if you kind of want a lighter fairy tale-esque read. It's not something I would usually read, so even if you don't think you would want to be in the mood for this, I would give it a try anyways if you kind of want something that's more like adventurous and light, even though it does get a bit dark at times. So yeah, I would check it out. If that sounds good to you. Oh, and I should say, there's a lot of really cool like art and stuff throughout. So it reads very quickly, and it's just really a fun time. It feels like a classic read, if that makes sense. So yeah, loved it. Okay, next I have a poetry collection called Finna by Nate Marshall. This one came onto my radar because of Matthew Sharappa, who I asked for some poetry recommendations for a beginner, and he recommended this one, and I absolutely loved it. I think this poetry collection is so good. It's so searing and emotional and smart and moving. I thought it was amazing. So basically, kind of like the core of this book is looking at Black vernacular, discussing the way that Black speech and vernacular kind of plays into Black identity and personhood, and the influence that it's had on like pop culture, and how its kind of pervasiveness and appropriation by white people is kind of used to the detriment of Black people, and how it's kind of like a reclaiming of the Black vernacular overall. And so yeah, I really loved it. I was often moved by these poems. I think they're beautiful and tight and really well structured and just really innovative. Like sometimes he flips the page or you have to turn it upside down, and it was just really fun the way he plays with form and structure. And yeah, highly recommend. It's so good. Lovely poetry. Okay, next I listened to Shakespeare in a Divided America by James Shapiro. This is something I would never usually read or listen to, but it made the top 10 of the New York Times best books of 2020. I remember liking Shakespeare a bit like in middle school and high school, and I thought this book was interesting in the sense that it looks at Shakespeare in the way that it played a very pivotal role in U.S. history, and looking at the way different presidents or different events in U.S. history were kind of influenced or considered in light of Shakespeare's plays. And so there's a bunch of different topics discussed in this book, including miscegenation, the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, the development of marriage in the U.S., and like class warfare as well. It looks at how many of Shakespeare's plays were so influential on the U.S. and its development, in the way that political thinking was heavily influenced by Shakespeare's thinking, in the way that it ended up kind of influencing how everything is today. Because it's obvious William Shakespeare is a very pervasive and prolific writer, of course, but despite that, I didn't really realize before this how much his works were so pivotal in the way that society was formed in the US, and how some of the most powerful people in this country kind of thought about politics in light of his plays. And so yeah, I thought it was a really interesting read. Sometimes it got a little bit dense for me, but overall I think it's very approachable. I do think that this book is best enjoyed if you have a good familiarity with the plot of Shakespeare's plays. For me, I didn't know a lot about many of them. Like I'd read Hamlet and Macbeth and Romeo and Juliet in high school, but I didn't really remember the plots fully. And James Shapiro kind of assumes that you know what the Shakespeare plots are, but he still kind of clues you in to like the main themes and events that happen in the play, so you understand where he's getting at. But overall, I feel like I could have appreciated it more if I had read those. So if you are a Shakespeare buff, or if you like US history, or both, or you want to just learn more about how influential Shakespeare was, I would definitely try this one. It was really interesting and out of my comfort zone, but I liked it. So try something new this month. And last but absolutely not least, I have my favorite book of the year so far, I think, and that is George Saunders' A Swim in a Pond in the Rain. I've talked about this book in like 4 videos already. I've been reading this for like over a month now. So I'll keep it brief. What George Saunders does here is he gives you 7 classic short stories from Russian writers such as Tolstoy and Anton Chekhov and Gogol. What he does is with each story, he kind of gives you the story, and then he goes into some essays in which he analyzes why he thinks the stories are so successful, and from a craft perspective, why these stories were built the way they were, and why they keep the reader engaged or not, in the way that anticipation and escalation and the overall themes that these writers are exploring here, why they work so well in the short form. I think this book is ultimately super important for both readers and writers to think through, because I myself am not a writer, and while this book seems to be slightly geared more towards writers and readers, it's really amazing in the sense that it helps you think through why short stories work or do not for you, and ultimately be able to pinpoint the way that stories escalate and circle back on each other, and the way patterns are used, and when certain plot elements are omitted, how that bolsters a story. And overall, I just thought it was so brilliant. I loved like the warmth with which George Saunders writes his essays and his thinking about these stories. You can tell he absolutely loves these stories and writing itself. And it's so reflective in the way that he takes the time to identify exactly why these stories mean so much to him, and why he thinks they work so well, and how they influence his writing. I think if you're passionate about reading, you have to read this book. If you want to learn more about short stories, please read this book. If you love short stories, please read this book. If you hate short stories, please read this book. It's so rewarding. I learned so much. It made me want to try writing. One of the reasons why I never really wanted to try writing was because I thought you needed to have an idea for a story. But ultimately, what George Saunders explains in one part of this book that I love so much was he said, you don't really need an idea. You need a sentence, you need a starting place, and then what you do is you build on it, you escalate, you consider where you want the story to go. How are you going to make things more interesting? How are you going to propel the reader to read more? And ultimately, he really honed in on the way that revision is ultimately the core of writing, in terms of getting something on paper and going back to it and thinking, okay, why does this sentence make me kind of dip into boredom, or why is this making me excited? And if something's kind of putting you down in a story, revising it, fixing it, getting it polished, no matter how long it takes until you get the story that you want. And that's how stories can kind of build on themselves, and you learn more about where you want the plot to go, what you were thinking subconsciously about where you wanted these characters to go or the plot to go. And I don't know, I'm ranting now, but basically I just love this book so much, and there's so much to learn. I highlighted the hell out of it. Oh, it's so good. It's a gift. It's a gift. I love it. I think all readers should read it. It's so good. Please try it. I love it. Okay. That about does it for my February wrap up. If you try any of these, I always say this, I hope you like it. Till next time, cheers.